computer vision essentially is making a prediction about Y given an image X. And image X can be a camera image, it could be a spectrogram, it could be a frame in a video. And given an image X, what we do is we train a model to predict some property about image X. And that Y could be a class, or it could be a bounding box, it could be pixel-wise classification for segmentation. So that Y could be a probability, directly mappable, or a confidence score. So an example being 95% elephant or 5% giraffe. And in computer vision, what we're trying to do is we try to learn this model that estimates P of Y given X from data. And here what we mean by supervised is we basically learn this model given a data and its label pair. So it's supervised as in we have labels for the data that we have. Okay, so this is like a very simple version and a very oversimplification of what computer vision is. And in today's lecture, we're going to talk a lot about data. And so to start, I know that everyone brought your own data that we're going to be working with and training our models on. So we're going to talk a little bit about what ideal qualities of a prototype data set is. So I'm just going to highlight 5 here to start off. 1, it's an ambitious one, but a reasonable one. It should be a reasonable representative sampling of your entire data set. And we're going to talk a little later about how it's sometimes impossible to have a representative sample of the real distribution. And we're going to talk about how we can maybe evaluate if your model will be able to generalize in these scenarios. Another really important thing is your data set should be relatively standardized, sanitized, structured, and serverable. And by serverable, what we mean is it should be easy and relatively quick to move around. And we're all going to be uploading our data to the Jetstream 2 server on Thursday morning. So by relatively quickly, we don't mean that it has to happen in a split second. We just mean that it shouldn't take like 48 hours for everything to move onto the server. Your data should also be inspectable with minimal tooling or with default programs. So an example that I want to give here is there are a lot of data inspection tools available to us that we can use that we don't have to like code manually. So Coco is a data set. Is anyone familiar with Coco or have heard about Coco? Okay, so there's a lot of tools already available to kind of like visualize and do a data analysis on annotations that are in this Coco format. So if you want to be able to use those tools, then you kind of want to make sure that your data or labels or annotations are in that format so that it can be easily loaded and inspected by existing tool set. So one time I was collecting data with my iPhone and all of my images got saved in the HEIF format, which is like the really high efficient compressible format that is not JPEG or PNG. And like I try to use it for some ML training and it just like was breaking everywhere. Like none of the tooling that I was using was like compatible or recognizing it as an image. Something like that is what we mean by like we want it to be relatively standardized. Also, we want to be able to manually inspect our data from time to time. Inspecting our data and understanding our data is really, really helpful. And by this, what we mean is like you probably don't want your entire data set zipped into a single file. You want to be able to, randomly select certain data points from time to time, take a look at it and understand what is going on in your data set for analysis later on. And a lot of these practices are maybe not really things that will really like affect the performance of your model if you're training on this data, but it will really make all of our lives easier and like especially your lives easier when we are inevitably debugging and trying to understand like what is going on with our model when our model starts learning from this data. So one thing that we should remember is a machine learning model is always only as good as the data that it's given because all of our models are learning from the data. So you kind of want to make sure that the data that we're providing it is as high quality as possible. Okay, so more simplification. Here, we're just going to try to model a really simple classification case, which is learning to categorize different type of points on a plane. And we're going to assume that this is the data set that we have. It's a two-dimensional data. We have orange data, blue data, and we have multiple data points here, approximately 12, I would say. And then we also assume that we have representative data, which means it's IID. And from what I have learned, ecologists are also statisticians. So I'm assuming that all of you guys are more than familiar with what IID means. If you aren't, it means independent and identically distributed. It basically is an assumption that every single data point is independent from each other and they're all drawn from an identical distribution. And here, what we can do is using our labeled data, we can learn a reasonable linear classifier, which means a classifier with parameters that learns to kind of separate the two classes that we have of interest. So using our labeled data, we learn this classifier, but then let's say that you learn the classifier, but you have learned it from every single data point that you have available, right? So how do we know after learning this one classifier if this model is the right model or if this will work? Like, how do we evaluate it? So one way, and a pretty like obvious way, is you can get more data and then you can label it and then you can test this existing model on that new data and essentially like try to evaluate its performance. But another thing you can do is when you have this labeled data already, maybe it's like annoying to collect more data. Maybe you don't have capacity to collect more data and label it. So you can instead pretend that when you have this data set already, that you don't have some of the data during training time, and you set it aside for validation or testing, and then test on that data instead to do model selection. And that is kind of like the most common approach. And here is an example of what that subsetting means. So we have this entire data, and because the data is assumed to be IID, we can subset it pretty randomly. So you subset it like randomly, and then you use some of it as training data and rest of it as evaluation data. So you want to use more of it for training and less of it for evaluation typically. And then here's one example of what model you would learn using only the training data. And then you would see if that model does well by checking your predictions against the evaluation data that you have set aside. So in this particular case, our validation data, our model is able to actually classify them correctly, which is what we want, and it's a good model. But one thing to keep in mind is when you're learning a linear classifier, there's a lot of possible ways that a linear classifier can be learned that would perfectly solve this training set. So every single line on this graph, you can consider it to be like a different classifier, and every single classifier with this training data like separates it perfectly. But we have to keep in mind that when you evaluate it on the held out validation data, not all the classifiers would work perfectly well. So kind of the practice of training multiple data or testing out multiple hyperparameters and then selecting it based on the best validation performance is called model selection. Is that pretty straightforward to people? We're on the same page? Okay, perfect. So here's the caveat, right? So we set aside training data to only and that's the data that the model looks at when it's learning. And then we set aside validation data so that we can do reasonable model selection. But then the thing is, our validation data set, if we do our model selection on the validation data set and we try to get the maximum accuracy on this validation data set, it means that this data set isn't truly unseen, if that makes sense. In some ways, you're like not training on it directly, but you're still trying to maximize your performance on this validation data set by selecting your hyperparameters, by selecting your model type, and etc. So sometimes we further subsample the data set to include a test set, and this test set is meant to be a set that is like most representative of your real life scenario. So it's like kind of like what you would expect the performance to be at deployment. So you didn't do any of the selection or any model selection or any training on this test set, and you do everything on the training and validation set. And then when your final model is selected and it's finalized, then you evaluate it on the test set. And then that is kind of like the performance that you should be reporting. And that is like the real performance of your model and your data. We will get to this later, but a lot of us are just really, really bad at this. And you can kind of imagine, like psychologically speaking, if you're a machine learning researcher like myself, like I work on this model for many, many months and I think it's amazing. And I'm like selecting it using the validation set and it's getting like 95%, 96%. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's ready to be published. Let me like test it on the test set and your test set is like 70%. Then psychologically speaking, if you know that it's kind of shit at your test set, it's in a lot of our nature to go back and be like, oh, something's wrong, we gotta improve it and try to maximize our performance on the test set. But this kind of like does compromise the integrity of the whole pipeline because you want to be honest about your model, kind of like, and the performance of your model at deployment time, which kind of means that your test set should not at all be part of your kind of like model selection and design and your training. So this is just one thing to keep in mind. I think in our context of our not summer school, of our workshop, there's no real benefit in us trying to cheat our performance up in a test set because I think all of us are trying to be able to use these tools like in real world. So just because we're able to maximize our results on some test set doesn't mean that model is going to work well in real life. So ideally speaking, we want to have a test set that will give us a nice like holistic view of like how our model will perform in context that we want to use it in. Okay, so the combination of having a data set, a task, and in this scenario, it's a binary classification task, and how to evaluate it, and a particular data split, so like having the train validation and test data split, overall is called a benchmark. And in the machine learning field, this benchmark is kind of how we do science. Like it's in some ways it feels a little silly. Like we have a lot of benchmarks and we try to maximize our performance on many of the benchmarks. So what's really cool is it's always been a really integral role of computer vision research. And many of these benchmarks, so Coco is the one that I mentioned earlier today in our lecture. ImageNet have people heard about ImageNet? Worked with or heard about? That's like one of the first like major benchmarks in our computer vision field. MNIST is a handwriting type data set. CFAR is another data set. And many of these benchmarks, some of these benchmarks have actually been developed in Pietro's lab, who is at Caltech, and we all met yesterday, which is really cool. And a lot of Sarah's collaborators as well. And over time, a lot of computer vision research has been, getting one of the data sets from an existing benchmark and trying to develop new methods and new techniques and new architectures to try to get the test performance up on some of these benchmarks. But designing a good benchmark is really hard because you want your benchmark to be a problem that exists in the world that is not already too easy for these computer vision models to solve. And there is kind of a little bit of a sad workshop that happened a couple of years ago that addressed the reproducibility crisis in machine learning based science. A lot of the content of this workshop is online. So if this interests you, you should take a look at it. It was at Princeton. And to kind of give you guys a sense for what was covered at this workshop, so they did a deep dive into various different fields of machine learning. I know it's a little hard to read, but to highlight one slide, they read 17 papers from satellite imaging computer vision papers. And out of 17 of them, 17 papers had pitfalls when it came to the way that they were kind of benchmarking their method. And by pitfalls, what we mean is, to be more descriptive, all of these papers had non-independence between train and the test set. So there was a mistake in the way that they were splitting their data that was kind of like essentially overestimating the way that their model was performing or being overly optimistic about the way that their model was performing. And they were presenting that number in the scientific paper when it's not really a good representation of how that model actually performs in real life. And they actually have this, as you can see, for many, many rows and many, many fields. And yeah, it was a pretty pivotal workshop. And when I say non-independence between test and train set, this is one example of what I mean by that. And this is an example of possible data poisoning. And I bring this up because I think maybe a lot of us here have sequential data or data that's sequential by nature. So that could be like multiple frames of camera trap, or it could be, I don't know, if people are using video models, people have sequences of videos, or I don't know, someone's really excited about a bird that they saw and they just take multiple pictures because they're really excited. And I think this is a pretty reasonable type of data set if you're working with camera trap images, for example. So let's say that you're doing a split and you're trying to split this data set into a training set, a validation set, and a test set. So if we treat every single data point here independently, which we shouldn't do, but if we do, then the split might look something like this. So you will have a random ratio or random percentage of these images will go into the train set, random percentage will go into the validation set, and then the test set. And one thing to note here is there's clearly some shared information between the splits that is occurring here because of the nature of the data, kind of the data structure. So there's information leakage. So it's pretty like self-explanatory. So if you have, it's kind of like teaching a child what this turkey is. Apparently it's a turkey in Mexico. So assume that you are a child or you're a machine learning model, same thing. And you're taking a look at the training data only. And you're told that image 1, image 3, image k+1, k+2, k+4 are your training data. And you're like, these are turkeys. And then you evaluate this model at validation time to do model selection. And then you show image 2 at validation time. And obviously, when you see image 2, you're like, I have seen image 1, and I was told that image 1 is a turkey. Image 2 looks the same. So that's clearly also a turkey. And this model doesn't even have to really know what a turkey looks like. It can cheat based on context. So it can memorize the background. We learned earlier today about kind of like the inner workings of neural networks and all the convolution layers and transformers and whatnot. So to be a little more technical, if you like take a representation of an image like that are extremely similar, the embedding that you get of these images are going to be almost identical or extremely similar. And it's going to be so easy for the model to kind of cheat their way out of making a prediction in a robust way, if that makes sense. So if this type of data poisoning is happening, the chances are at test time, your model is going to perform amazing. It's going to be the best and the worst day of your life. Your model is going to be giving you like 99%, 100%, and you think you have solved science. And then you take a look and you realize like, oh, it's actually not really learning what I want it to learn. And this is just one thing to keep in mind. If you have sequential data, try to separate, like maintain the independence between the sequences when you're splitting it into train and validation splits. And I'm gonna touch upon this a little bit later about redundancy in your data. So sometimes if you have data that looks extremely similar to each other, another practice is to deduplicate your data set. So you may think like, oh, maybe it's good to have 4 identical pictures of this turkey in this environment just because it helps the model to learn. But sometimes redundancy doesn't quite help or boost performance. So it's better to diversify your data than to repeat information. So that's just another thing that I'm going to touch upon later. But this is kind of what you want to do instead of splitting it randomly in situations like this. Yeah. The question was regarding deduplication. Is it bad to have duplicates in your training data or your validation data? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it kind of is like that's a bit of a nuanced question. So majority of the time, if you have like 2 copies of your data here and there, it's definitely not gonna hurt your performance. If you're gonna have 1,000 images, you don't, it's better to have 1,000 different images than like maybe that like 500 unique images and like duplicates of that, obviously, just so that you can diversify your data if possible. But if you have duplicates or if you have multiple versions or a sequence here and there, it shouldn't really hurt. Yeah, it shouldn't hurt your performance. But one way that it can hurt is if it goes like way overboard. So if all you have is just kind of like sequential images, then it might be a little better to add diversity and like to try to reduce like over, because the model can kind of like overfit on characteristics that are shared between your data if it's for a certain class. So if all the images that you have of this turkey are only from sequence 1, then sometimes it's better to reduce kind of like deduplicate sequence 1 because you don't want the model to kind of overfit and think that all the characteristics that are shared between every image in the sequence are like means turkey. So like including the background and whatnot. But I think just light amount of duplication here and there from my experience, like in practice, shouldn't really hurt. Okay. Okay, so we kind of talked about the standard practice of data splitting, but I mentioned earlier that an assumption that we should make is that we have data that is representative of our bigger sample. But what if our initial assumption was kind of wrong? Like, what if the data that we have or data that we ended up labeling isn't really representative of what we care about or the whole distribution? So if we assume kind of like the model that we trained, the binary classification model that we trained, and we have more capacity, we got more funding, and we have more undergrads to label more data, and we label that data, and it turns out that when you evaluate the model that we initially trained on this additional data, our model is just wrong. So in this particular case, we can see that our current model would classify all of those additionally labeled orange points as blue. And this is a problem. And there is a term for this. So if we consider kind of like the domain of the original data, and we call it the red circle, the new data that we collect, we can call it out of domain. So it's a pretty popular term in machine learning. Ideally, when we are training a model or training a classifier, we want it to work on all possible data. So if there's a lot of out-of-domain data, you want it to work on all possible out-of-domain data, but it's extremely challenging if you have never seen that data outside of the red circle before. So this is a really cute aside in ecology. This is like very similar to extrapolation, just slight difference in terminology. And this, we call it domain shifts. So when there is a domain that you have a relatively representative data for, but you know that there's gonna be different types of out of distribution shifts that are occurring in the wild that you want your model to be generalizable to, we call it domain shifts. And I mentioned that we have a lot of benchmarks in computer vision. And there are a lot of benchmarks that try to explicitly study how models will perform under these domain shifts. So wild is a collection of data sets that have been published by a series of computer vision researchers that explicitly study this problem. And Sarah actually contributed a data set called iWildCam to the wild benchmark. So to give us a better understanding of what I mean by, probing this in an explicit way, we can build evaluation frameworks that measure both in distribution performance and out of distribution performance. So going back to the camera trap question, if you have many, many cameras, then for your training data may be camera 1 to camera 1 to 45, and data that you collected from, I don't know, 2013 all the way up to 2020. And then your in-distribution test data will be data that you collect after that time period, but at the same camera trap location. So it's in distribution because you have tons of data at these particular locations with the species that occur at these locations that you have trained your model on. And then you're just simply evaluating it in the same kind of domain as your training data. But then here, out of distribution test data might look like a completely new camera trap location. So camera 246, maybe it's a new location, maybe it has a different set of species. And in general, pretty intuitive, like your performance is expected to drop in general when you are training a model in distribution and you're evaluating it out of distribution. Well, one thing that's for sure is this doesn't only occur in ecological data, this happens just in machine learning as a whole. And domain shifts are ubiquitous in many, many real world scenarios. And these are examples of kind of the accuracy drop that you experience when you go out of distribution in many, many tasks. So satellite imagery, there's head detection, there's some scaffold prediction, etc. And there's a clear drop in performance in a lot of these scenarios. And one thing that we should keep in mind is that performance degrades out of distribution even for very common classes. So you might think that, oh, this bobcat bobcat in general occurs a lot in my data set, but when you have kind of out of distribution type images, even if it's a common species, the performance still drops. And the reason why we care about generalization, reason why we care about kind of being realistic on how our models might perform OOD is because real world in general is never IID. So we always have domain shift. This is a really cool visualization that I like. That is a map of global biodiversity. And then on the right side is a species occurrence data. So where we have data available in GBIF. And we can very, very clearly see that there is no correlation, or there's almost an inverse correlation. So if we were to, theoretically kind of do some, learn a model based on the data that we have available, then the real world data that we might want to monitor or evaluate on is going to be out of distribution from the data that we have learned from. So just keep keep going in this direction on why this is so hard. Subpopulation shift is one thing. I think yesterday at lunch, we were talking about mushroom foraging. I think Rachel mentioned she really wants to see chanterelles. And then everyone else at the table popped up and they were like, oh, you should come here or you should come there. Like we see it all the time. And obviously there's different species likelihoods in different locations, even if you have the same possible set of species. So another possibility is that you might go to a new location and now there's a whole different set of possible species. So if you have trained your model in North America and you take it to Africa, the species overlap there isn't really is gonna be minimal. And this is one example of how class distribution changes for every camera trap location. And you might think it's obvious if location 1 is in one continent and location 514 is in another continent, but this is also the case if you have camera traps within the same park, because certain animals have, their territories and they have preferred routes between the parks. So certain camera traps, even if they're not very far from each other, will show different types of class distribution. And in general, this is pretty obvious, but performance has strong correlation with how similar different distributions are. So this is a figure from one of Sarah's papers that was essentially training models in urban forests. And she did a lot of cross evaluation where they trained on certain cities and then evaluated their models on other cities. And the left figure here kind of shows the distribution similarity. So darker darker points in the left figure corresponds to like more similar distribution. And then the right figure here kind of shows the level, like street level accuracy that they were able to achieve when they trained on one city and then evaluated on another. And you can see kind of like the high accuracy, which is brighter colors, correspond pretty well with the darker colors on the left side, which is like more similar distribution. So like more similar distribution equals higher performance, which is kind of like pretty intuitive. There's a pretty fun example of this. Like I'm from Toronto, I did undergrad there, and I did some robotics research. And there's a program at U of T called WinTour. Like it's like winter, but like Win Toronto. And it basically it came about because a lot of self-driving car research is developed in California. And a lot of the models are trained on the Californian roads, which are very sunny, they're beautiful. There's no rain, it's always, very consistent, and these models do really well. And then some people like purchase these cars or try to run these models like in Toronto during a windstorm, not a windstorm, like during the winter, in snowstorm, and like everything just fails. And this resulted in they even like started a program to try to like solve this out of distribution like generalization problem, and they started the WinTour program, and it's like they got so much funding and everyone up in north are really excited about it. They're like, yay, we finally get like self-driving cars in the north, because a lot of these things break when you go to out of distribution site. And yeah, this happens just in ecology a lot, but also in self-driving cars, robotics, etc. Just in general, like it's a common problem. So when we talk about distribution shift, I talked a little bit about subpopulation shift, but this distribution shift in general can appear in many, many different ways. So different camera angles, sensor types, backgrounds, individuals' ages, night and day is big thing, summer and winter, which is what I just mentioned. Wet and dry, I'm pretty sure Sarah added that there because of her like snow leopard situation. She said like between a wet snow leopard and a dry snow leopard, it was really, really hard to re-ID them. And in general, these are just some of the problems that we think about and some of the shifts that we try to be robust to in computer vision. Yeah, so these are examples of high visual similarity from one camera trap to another. And then here are also more examples of visual differences that can occur across camera traps. So you can see why it may be so challenging for a model to learn. And obviously there's temporal and seasonal changes. It's kind of wild because if you look at this image, like the bobcat, I think it's a bobcat, correct me if I'm wrong, in the left image and the right image, like it's walking very similarly from right to left with the prey in its mouth, but you can clearly tell from the vegetation around it that it's a different season or a different time of year. This is a pretty gnarly picture that I think Sarah included. It's a picture of a coyote, and every single square, there's like temporal progression. So the coyote was there one day, and the next 2 days there was this like really, really big fire. And then the fourth day, the coyote returned to the same environment. And one thing that we should keep in mind is these distribution shifts are rarely mutually exclusive. So if you have a subpopulation shift, the chances are you also have some type of visual shift. So it's really hard to kind of isolate them independently. And okay, so this is kind of a break slash a fun activity. It's gonna be a think, pair, and share activity. I think I'm gonna put in a timer for like maybe 5 minutes. We can take a break slash think about these questions individually. And then after the 5 minute mark, grab a person next to you or grab a small group of people in front, like next to you, and then try to discuss basically your answers to some of these activities. So from this point on, I'll put in a timer for 5 minutes and then we will return. How did the activities go? Good? Okay. We're just gonna bring everyone back for a second. I think there's some really good discussions happening. Honestly, I think it's gonna take more than 5 minutes to kind of dish this all out. So if there's any considerations, or any questions that people have about their own data, feel free to actually continue this discussion like amongst all the students, or grab an instructor and start asking questions if you want. And I'm just gonna wrap up the rest of this lecture really quickly while we're all here. So here is kind of an example of a headache data set, type of data set formatting that you don't want to use. So you can see over here, the camera image name is all over the place. The extensions are all over the place. The GPS locations, the way that you handle like empty data or null data is different. So like 0 for some, none for others. Someone named their cameras numerically, others named them using their name of choice, Fred. And we don't want our data to look like this in general. So a very clean, ideal data set may look something like this. So all the GPS locations are handled correctly, very standardized image naming, camera numbering, sequence numbering, etc. And then even when you look at it from like a file preview screenshot, it's just way cleaner than kind of this particular mess. But we've all been here. Like I have definitely been here. And yeah, so this is where we strive to be. Okay, so this is a lot of text, but a little bit of rules of thumb to end off our lecture. We want to make sure that all of our sensors, so I know not everyone is using cameras, maybe you have ARUs, it's relatively well, basically all the data that you have collected has days, seasons, biomes, species, or individuals that's relatively well represented. And then all labels and numerical values have the same format and type. And all sensitive data, if you have sensitive data, such as GPS locations, and you don't need this data, then we should remove it if it's not needed. If you need it as part of your model training, then obviously include that data. And also, this kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier. If you end up having bad data, make sure that your data is set up in a way that it's easy to remove. So you don't want your entire data set to be like really fixed. Like you don't want it to be like tarred up or in a zip file that you're like loading once and spitting out. Make sure it's kind of like organized in a way that's relatively clean. If you have a bad camera trap that a squirrel ate, every image is just messy, it didn't take any single good picture, then it's easy to kind of like delete that folder, remove it, and then continue on with your iteration. Okay, more of this. Make sure that empty values are treated in a really consistent way, or have a default way that you're handling some of these exceptions. Okay, this is a typo. Make sure your entire data set is less than, I believe our number is 100 or 150. We have a little bit of flexibility. So if your data set is over that, you should talk to one of us. But in general, that's the standard rule of thumb, I believe, Eric, right? Okay. Yeah. So in general, maybe satellite data or video data, if some of you guys have them, maybe a little larger, but that's okay. And if possible, we try to reduce a total number and depth of folders, so you don't want something extremely nested or many subfolders, for example. And then consistent file format. Okay, so finally, we want to make sure that you understand your data. I feel like this is probably not gonna be a little less of a problem with ecologists who are bringing their own data. But this happens a lot in computer science when we're using existing benchmarks. And we're not the ones, collecting all the ImageNet data or collecting all the COCO data. So sometimes, like in computer science, we end up downloading a data set, we're starting to train a model, and we observe some behavior about the model, and we're like, I have no idea why this is happening. Majority of the time, what you just need to do is like actually open that data set that you downloaded, and you look at the data and you're like, oh, the model is making this mistake because the data looks like this. Like, I understand why this mistake is happening. And I think this will definitely be the case for all of us. So the chances are to understand your model's behavior, understanding your data is really important. And having your data in a format that is easy to be inspected is going to like pay off on a long run. So that's a rule of thumb. Okay, so this kind of goes back to the deduplication question, point that I made earlier. So repetitive data during training time doesn't help that much in general. So this is an example of subsampling, CCT crop dots classification. And if you have really, really repetitive data, you can significantly reduce kind of like the number of training data that you're using, or like in this case, it's in percentage. And then the OD test accuracy. So from using 100% of your training data to reducing half of it, because your data is really repetitive, it like won't really hurt your accuracy on the long run. Like maybe having that 50% gives you that 0.4 gain, which may or may not be a error bar, to be honest, like who knows? But then deduplicating won't really hurt significantly. And reducing it to 25 does hurt performance, but not too much. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are kind of trying to decide between the amount of data that you have, but like the data that you have is extremely repetitive, then it's going to pay off to maybe, clean off some of that data so that you can iterate more quickly, and you're not going to gain a huge amount in accuracy by keeping that data. Another really big question that we typically have is to balance or not to balance. And ecology in particular is really long-tailed in nature, and the chances are we're probably not going to have really balanced data sets to begin with. And if you have really, really long tails or really highly imbalanced data, there are techniques that people can use to try to bring up performance on the tail classes. So one common technique is you're actually subsampling. You're trying to balance the training set by subsampling or reducing the number of samples that you have of the common classes. Another technique is you can upsample the rare classes instead, so you can sample it more frequently than the common classes in your data loader. You can also use class balance losses. To be honest, I think the amount that these techniques help tends to vary. So the class balance losses, in my experience, sometimes help significantly and sometimes can even hurt significantly. I think upsampling and I don't know about subsampling. Upsampling in general can help, but only if you make sure that you're kind of augmenting your data or like adding diversity to the data that you're upsampling, so that you're not seeing repetitive samples constantly from the tail. So I think unless you have extremely highly imbalanced data and your performance in the tail classes matter significantly, maybe it's best practice to just like train on your data distribution, because your data distribution is probably also representative of what you're experiencing in real life. You also will need to think about how you want to measure downstream performance with imbalance. So if you have an imbalanced training set, one way that you can kind of measure performance across every class, evenly, is you can balance your test set instead. So even if you have an imbalanced training set, you have a balanced test set, so your test set will kind of weigh every class evenly. Or another alternative, and this is Sarah's personal fave, also my personal favorite, is to maintain a realistic test distribution. So you don't really explicitly balance your test set, but have it be relatively realistic and reflective of the real world that you're testing in. But when you're evaluating your model, you use both balanced and imbalanced metrics. So by imbalance metric, what I mean is kind of like accuracy, for example, average accuracy as a whole. So if you have like 100 images of turkey and then like 10 images of helmeted guinea fowl, you would basically get the prediction on each individual, image that you have in your test set and then just average it evenly. So obviously, if you do really, really well on the turkey, but not well on the helmeted guinea fowl, it's not going to hurt the average performance as much because majority of your test set is the turkey. But you can also report a balanced metric, which is kind of like class per class accuracy. So if you care about how well you do on every single class, in addition to kind of like the whole distribution, then in addition to the overall average, you can also report per class average. So my accuracy on the helmeted guinea fowl, which is a smaller class, was 40%, but my accuracy on the turkey, which is a bigger class, was 80%. And that's one way to kind of like maintain a realistic test distribution. Okay, so I think I'm gonna go get through the rest of this and then we're gonna end off with a little bit of a brainstorming / another think, pair, share activity. So hang in there. So one way that so the reason why we care a lot about generalizability and like out of distribution performance is because it allows us to be realistic about what our model is able to achieve in the real world. So oftentimes, a lot of these tools, if you're developing it for other users and you want your tools to be used beyond kind of like your own project, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So a lot of, I think, AI practitioners sometimes promise, really robust or really accurate models that people who don't have an AI background will try to use in their use cases, and they will be like, oh, this is not as good as I expected it to be. And I think if you're doing really rigorous experimental practices, then you can be realistic about what your model will be able to do and will not be able to do. And this particular example is a project that Sarah was a part of called the Mega Detector, which I believe is a model that many of you guys have maybe used before, and it's open source and it's made a ton of impact in the ecological monitoring community. But she always tells us that the reason why it was able to be so impactful is because they were rigorously evaluating what type of models that they had were generalizable and what type of models weren't. And the model that they ended up publishing was a type of model that was class agnostic detection, but had a really high generalizable performance even on out of distribution data, and eventually, being realistic about what it's able to achieve and sharing that publicly and kind of evaluating that in a robust way allowed them to publish the model, and it was able to make pretty strong real world impact. So this is just one thing to keep in mind. And finally, to end off the lecture is a final think pair activity. So one kind of related to this particular slide, if your results are really good on your current data that you have, what can you reasonably claim your model can do? And then what data, if any, after the whole workshop, would you add to your data set to be more representative of your target use case? So I think, honestly, we don't have a lot of time until it's almost time. It's almost 2 p.m., but maybe we can spend like the next 5 minutes doing the think pair activity and then, yeah, call it a day in terms of lectures. So thank you.